And the last quote, which is crazy, companies won't be able to do a 6-month sprint to get prepared because it could take months or even a year to accomplish CMMC compliance. And this is Leidos saying this.
Hello, it's Jacob Hill with GRC Academy. Today I'm here with Mr. Daniel Akridge. Daniel, how are you today?
I'm fantastic. Jacob, how are you, sir?
Doing good. Thanks so much for coming on. And folks, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like, comment, share, subscribe, review, all the things. Helps me out. Thanks so much. Daniel, tell us about yourself. How'd you get to where you are today?
That's a great question. So I did not think I would end up in this chair today. If you look at the course of my career, so I've primarily been on the technical side of the house, hands-on keyboard, what I like to refer to as working at a living. So I've done various amounts of jobs, worked for a lot of MSPs, got the privilege of working at Army Material Command here in Huntsville, Alabama for quite a few years as well. So, it's definitely an interesting background because then I pivoted to something called the Director of Engagement here at Summit 7. The Director of Engagement, what I do is a lot of education and then a lot of sales as well. So I've moved from the hands-on keyboard working for a living to the education and selling aspect, which is an interesting bridge because you get to talk to a lot of very interesting people, some at the executive level that don't understand the technology, but understand the corporate risk element of it. And then a lot of technical people who have sadly been burdened with the full CMMC solution, even though it's not an actual IT problem. It's an organizational problem, as you've discussed on your podcast before. So I get to be a bridge and kind of a mediator between those two groups of people and get them on and through their compliance journey.
As of the time of this recording, it's March.
It is March.
We are past the change of administration. We are past the final program rule for CMMC being effective. CMMC assessments have begun. I just had Fernando Machado on the podcast. I think he said he's issued at this point 12 certifications, which is great to hear. Then on the other side of it, we have the Doge going on, right?
Oh, we got the Doge.
We got the Doge.
Is lit up with the Doge conversation, let me tell you.
That's right. So we have all of this going on. And what are you seeing from your perspective? And what are folks saying to you when you talk to them about CMMC?
So that's an interesting question because at the beginning of the year, there's a fair amount of momentum, right? 32 CFR dropped, CMMC certifications could begin. People were like, oh my gosh, this thing's actually happening, right? And then Doge, right? Inauguration happens, Doge happens, and people are like, thank God we have somebody that's going to cut CMMC out, right? And we're like, well, not exactly. It's like, Doge is looking for fraud, waste, and abuse. And the funny thing about CMMC is it's actually going to, expose who's been doing this cyber regulation and who hasn't been doing it since DFAR 7012 came out. Yes. And so the Doge conversation, it's a false hope for a lot of people because they think it's going to be, completely removed. There's just really not a strong, response to that. It's just not going to happen, especially when now you have the DoD CIO. It was the founder of the CMMC program back in the 2020 era. And so it's just interesting when you start looking at all these dynamics, a lot of people, have this false hope of it's not going to apply to me, or I don't have to get certified. I can continue to self-attest forever, right? And those are the major conversations we're having and having to kind of right the ship. Because what people don't realize is there's been some other things that have come out over the past few weeks, like the DoD memo on CMMC, right? And how you're supposed to incorporate that into contracts once 48 CFR, which is the CMMC contract clause, is released sometime around midsummer of this year.
Yeah, all this time, DoD just seems to be marching silently forward during the rulemaking process. I was speaking with Stacey Boscianic on the podcast a while ago, and I asked her, I was like, okay, so during this time period from when CMMC 2.0 was initially announced, I don't know, was it 2021, something like that?
Yeah.
There was a great silence, that occurred sometime after that. And I asked her, what happened? And she was like, oh, just tons of work. So they have been working on this nonstop on the rulemaking process. I know that Katie Arrington had thoughts about, should we do that? I think she was against it, but here we are. Now she's back in charge and she's just going to push for it all to happen as soon as possible, I'm sure. So like I said, initially when the change of administration happened and Doge came in, to be honest, I wasn't sure what was going to happen.
Hey, because me too. I didn't know what was going to happen.
Yeah, because it's all of this change happening so quickly. And then, the different interests that are there and who knows who has whose ear and all those things. But
Absolutely.
like, I would say that it's definitely here to stay. What is the pulse from your perspective and what you're seeing of the DIB right now when it comes to CMMC?
Man, that's a good question. So we actually did a survey a few months back. And if you look at this chart here, so we surveyed a little over 100 people inside of our network. 53% just need budget for it, right? They just need the ability to write the check to do the thing. 3%, they're not sure if CMMC is actually going to happen. 15% don't know if they even are going to need this. And this is a level 2 certification requirement. 29% are just waiting to see what happens, right? Again, in an election season, people don't know what's going to happen. Then the inauguration, the first 30 days, you don't really know what's going to happen. And DOJ just basically threw a lot of people for a loop, and they really, really thought it wasn't going to happen, right? And so when you're looking at charts like this, the majority of barriers, I guess you could say, are related to cost and budget, right? Now, here's the tricky part. A lot of people don't understand that, yes, like you absolutely have to have budget or else you can't do anything. But the longer you wait, the longer the backlog of people to help you is growing. I know you had Fernando on not too long ago, and Fernando's a great friend of Summit 7. He actually did both of our certifications here, both our corporate and our managed service. And he was saying that the backlog is just growing exponentially, right? Yeah. And even to be able to budget to get certified, let alone implement a solution, migrate into it, get all of your documentation written. And the longest pole in the tent is organizational adoption of all of those things, right? A cultural shift that takes a long time depending on the size of your organization. And so I say all this to say is budget's the biggest hurdle. My recommendation to people out there is definitely find the budget. And if you don't have the budget now, at least try and plan and understand what your realistic timeline looks like to get compliant. Because people call us up and say, Daniel, make me compliant in 30 days. Well, it's like, well, you obviously don't know how this works, right? Yeah. 30 days, I mean, that's a dream, right? For anyone able to do that. And honestly, it's a harsh reality that that's not even possible to do in 30 days. And so people just have to realize and have realistic timelines that match up when they're going to have funding and budget to do the CMMC journey.
Well, you mentioned this, the DoD memo to program managers on the DoD side, basically the criteria to determine CMMC levels for solicitations and for contracts. Let's dive into that.
Yeah, so a lot of people are coming to our front door and saying, Daniel, I just want to prepare for CMMC, but I think I'm fine to self-attest. And for a long time, if you looked at the phase rollout in 32 CFR and you looked at, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, it looked like phase 1, which would start when 48 CFRs drop. So that's the CMMC contract clause supposed to drop summer of 2025 here. Then it looked like everybody could self-attest for a really long time, and there would only be a few organizations that would have to certify. Right? If you read it just in the words in front of you, it kind of feels like there's a little bit of a 12-month lead time before you actually have to go through certification. And a lot of people, again, were saying, I just want to get ready to get certified middle of next year, end of next year, and end of next year being 2026. And the DoD dropped this memo a few weeks back, clarifying to their internal contracting officer when to incorporate certification requirements and when to allow self-attestation. This would also be applicable to phase 1 of the CMMC rollout. And so when you're looking at this, it basically says, hey, for FCI, we already know for CMMC level 1, not a requirement to certify. So you're good there, right? CMMC level 2 for non-defense categories, which is a large portion of the National Archives CUI registry. You know what? You get to self-attest except for things that we deem critical. And that'll be kind of more on a contract by contract basis. But then you get to things in the Defense CUI organizational index. So you get to controlled technical information. You get to critical infrastructure. You get to UNMPI, naval nuclear propulsion information. You get to these types of things. The largest of these categories is controlled technical information, especially for manufacturers, construction, regulated research is a really big one there as well. And you see that anything with the DoD distribution statement of B through F also incorporates controlled technical information. You very quickly have the requirements to certify based on the DoD memo that was published. And this slide that you see here on the screen This is just a representation of that memo from the DoD procurement toolbox of what guidance internally DoD contracting officers to have or are to have to put into solicitations, right? Give people the heads up. This is the requirement. And then at time of contract award, people have to be able to produce said certification or be able to fully attest to CMMC compliance if it's CUI outside of the defense category. All right, so if you're looking here on the screen, this is the National Archives, and they are the holder of all that is CUI. And in order for something to be CUI, it has to have a law, regulation, or government-wide policy applied to the type of data that's defined here, right? So when you're looking at this, not everything can be CUI. If the DoD is like, you know what, I feel like this is sensitive enough, it should be CUI, that's not how controlled and classified information works. That's kind of more of the FOUO days, which has been deprecated now for quite a few years. This type of information, this controlled and classified information, actually has to have some sort of supporting documentation validating that, yes, it actually is sensitive. So when you scroll through this, you see a lot of different, what they call organizational index groupings. So on the left-hand side, these are just broad sweeping categories: critical infrastructure, defense, export control, financial, immigration, so forth and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, a couple of really good things to know about the CUI registry: not all CUI is even applicable to contractors, to federal contractors. Mm-hmm. A lot of CUI, like if you look at budget, for example, here, highlighted here on the screen, budget is related to how federal agencies have to submit their budget to the Office of Management and Budget. Has nothing to do with federal contractors. So that's kind of good to know as well. Just because you see it in this list does not mean that it's applicable to you.
Now, my QuickBooks is CUI. Everybody panic.
Yeah, oh my gosh, but I kid you not. I've had this conversation. There was a large construction company that I did an offsite strategy engagement with, and they were like, their finance team came in and they said, oh my God, we saw that our budget could be CUI. I said, are you doing federal budgets? Like, is that in scope of what you're doing? They're like, no, just our corporate. I was like, oh, well, then you have nothing to worry about. And then we did this fun exercise of the drill down.
Yeah, I remember years ago when I first started down the NIST and CMMC trail, I looked at this and I was scared to death. Oh, I was overwhelmed.
Everybody is, because they're like, this is so many things. I mean, proprietary information's on here, right? I mean, just business proprietary specifically. And so you look at this, everything has to be compliant. Yeah. Every piece of data I have as a company has to be compliant. It's like, whoa. Let's calm down here. Ryan Bonner and the organization DefCert, the business that he owns, and his team do an incredible job of dissecting each individual category and if it's even applicable to you guys. So if you, for some reason, have a need to dissect CUI more, I highly recommend reaching out to Ryan Bonner. He's a fantastic resource.
Yeah, agree. I'm going to have him on the podcast next, actually.
Oh, fantastic. He's a rock star, man. I'm a big fan. So Going back to here, if you look at the CUI categories and you look at the DoD memo, you see so many of these are likely going to allow self-attestation for the first year one. But the funny thing is, the defense category, specifically controlled technical information, is probably somewhere north of 60% of the type of data that's produced in defense contracts. Okay. So meaning you're looking at least about 60% of the supply chain having to receive a certification before they're able to take award of this contract. And not only them, their supply chain as well, because that's the way that it's written, where the prime has to be certified at level 2, but then that certification requirement has to flow all the way down and follow the data, just like DFAR 7012, right? So if there's controlled and classified information, that requirement has to be inherited from the very top all the way to the very bottom.
Yeah. And DoD CIO, I think they have this grand vision of CMMC Level 2 certified contractors up here, and then a supply chain beneath them of a CMMC Level 1s, right? Of small businesses and whatever. But the thing that has to be addressed is portion marking. And portion marking is optional. If you don't have well-marked documents that says this is CUI and the rest of this is not, they can't effectively remove the CUI and pass it down through the supply chain of lesser CMMC levels. The phase-in is going to be rocky. It's going to be rough. People are going to be risk averse.
You have these large primes, the Lockheeds, the Raytheons, the Boeings, right? The large primes in this space that their contracting officers don't know what their staff are going to send down the supply chain.
Yeah.
So they want to cover themselves. And because a prime to sub relationship is a private contract, not a federal contract, they could even, if they wanted to, start incorporating these requirements even before 48 CFR is live.
Yes.
Because it's a private contract, right? So to your point, Jacob, I would highly recommend organizations asking their prime on what their timeline for them should be for certification, because it's probably a lot quicker than waiting for the 48 CFR to come out in summer of this year.
Yeah, agreed. Let's dive into that CTI category there.
Yeah, so when you're looking at controlled technical information, this is specifically related to a small subset of information that is what they call non-COTS or consumer off the shelf. So if you're making consumer off the shelf products, you are likely exempt from this. However, if you're doing any level of customization, specifically with like non-public information, right? Sensitive information that only you and the person issuing the contract, like the DoD or the prime, might actually know, that's when you're likely falling into this controlled technical information. But it's kind of a rabbit hole, right? So this is a great little category description at the top. But as you scroll down, this is some banner information. Like I mentioned before, you have to have a law, regulation, or government-wide policy in order for this to be considered CUI. Well, the DoD defined this inside of our good friend DFAR 7012. And so when you actually look at DFAR 7012, talk about a dense read, inside of it, they actually call out the definition of technical information. You see that in the upper right-hand corner here. And that references, guess what, Jacob? Another publication. So if you do a quick little Google search here for DFAR 7013, this is actually popping the hood under what type of technical information could very well be controlled technical information. And again, this is relating to things that are not consumer off-the-shelf products or COTS services. So you see things like detailed manufacturing process down here, or process data. Ooh, that's significant. Covered government support contractors, just a definition there. We have computer program, computer database. We've got, anyways, technical data as the ultimate definition down here. I say all this to say is you have a lot of different definitions that lawyers would love to fight and debate about. And because it seems to be such a vast category, this is where experts like Ryan Bonner come into play. Because it seems like such a dense category, you really need to have an expert review this with you based on the types of data that you're working with. So you can actually defend your position on why you may or may not have CUI, because it could save your company hundreds of thousands of dollars if you can justify not having or needing to receive controlled technical information.
Yeah, great points. Great points. And I don't know what you think, but my opinion on the CMMC Level 1 conversation. The government doesn't really know what FCI is, or federal contract information, or the FAR CUI rules new nomenclature for it. Isn't it covered federal information?
Yeah.
I think, okay, well, they're still trying to get all that figured out, what even to call it, but nobody really understands what it means or what it actually is. In my opinion, there's some basic definitions out there, but that risk aversion, I think, is really going to come into play. Like I said, I just feel like the phase in is going to be really rocky. That was really great information. Thank you so much for that. So I guess the next natural question at this point is, all right, well, we got to prepare for CMMC. What's the timeline look like these days? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so Jacob Horn, who's a friend of the show as well and a great friend of mine, put this slide together and try to consolidate as much as possible, right? So when you're looking at this, there's really three things to pay attention to. There's the very top row, which has already happened. This is that 32 CFR. So this is allowing commercial certifications to start. This went live December 16th of last year, being December 16th of 2024. So now you can go receive a commercial certification. You call up one of your friendly C3PAOs, you get on the schedule, and then you go get certified. Knock on wood, right? You pass your certification. Now, the second bar here, this black bar here, this is the 48 CFR. And this is still waiting to finish rulemaking. So right now, the DoD has to submit that because it's after the public comment period, back to OIRA which is under the Office of Management and Budget, has to submit that for finalization. So based on historics, we're looking to see that happen sometime between May and June for that to become final. Now, this black bar should scare you to death because once this goes live in its final state, the phased rollout will begin. So phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. So phase 1 would start putting in solicitations, the requirement for CMMC at either a self-attestation level for CMMC levels 1 or non-defense CUI or level 2, or if you have defense level CUI like controlled technical information, the need to actually produce a certification at time of contract award. So you can go and bid all day long, but you can't be awarded the work if there's a certification requirement and you're not able to produce said certification. Now, Jacob did a bunch of research through GAO and found that the median time for RFP to DoD contract award is 32 days. And so if you take the time it typically takes in an award cycle, plus this bottom bar down here, which is the average CMMC implementation time, you see there's a pretty big delta, right? There's basically an extra 11 months that you need to back into in order to plan accordingly and actually go get certified. So this would include potentially migrating to or creating an enclave, moving your whole organization to the Gov Cloud, scheduling and going under an assessment, having all the documentation ready, having your team trained and ready. When you look and stack all those things, you're looking at about a 12-month runway. And so if June happens and the CMMC rule is final and starts going into solicitations and you win, or tentatively are supposed to win a contract in fall or, winter of 2025, you will very likely have to also produce a certification, meaning if you have not started your CMMC journey, you will likely not be able to take award of that contract, which is really scary to say because a lot of businesses, either have net new contracts they're pursuing or potentially contract option years that are going to come up post 48 CFR in this new world that we're living in. Right. And so when you're looking at this, just be aware, look at contract option years hitting Q3, Q4 of this calendar year, and then look at your BD's pipeline and try and figure out through teaming agreements and just general contracts you're trying to pursue, what might be impacted by this again in the second half of the year.
Yes. And I do think that CMMC certification early on will be a big competitive differentiator because in the RFI process, market research process of the government, they're going to try to determine, is the supply chain ready for CMMC? And if you're in the pool of people that is ready, maybe that's 5 contractors. You know what I mean? That will greatly reduce the amount of competition available, but there's going to be a lot of people also who are not ready. Right?
Oh, a ton of people for sure.
Yeah. I really do believe that it will be a competitive advantage.
Oh, absolutely. And you look at a large prime like Leidos, right? This is a quote from their CISO, just a few lines to pick out here. They just can't pick the best solution or best partner here because I'm getting my best margin return or have a product or capacity to deal with it. Representation of compliance. That's what the government's asking us to do as primes, meaning they have to pick now suppliers and subs that can meet the requirement.
Yes.
And the last quote, which is crazy, companies won't be able to do a 6-month sprint to get prepared because it could take months or even a year to accomplish CMMC compliance. And this is Leidos saying this, and they're addressing this publicly to their supply chain. You guys have to be ready. And Leidos can't just pick you because you have a good product. They have to pick you because you're meeting all the requirements as well.
I'm a VP of cyber at a defense contractor, and I think that timeline is exactly right. Even for a small contractor, 20 people or even less, the thing people have to understand is that it's not easy to go into and build an environment that has to comply with regulations. It cannot be Wild West. Your people have to be on the same page. You have to have all these documented policies and procedures. That is not normal for a small business.
No, not at all.
And it takes a lot of time to accomplish.
Yeah, if you can do it as a small business, it's incredible. We jokingly say if you have somebody in your team able to do that, like you just keep a close eye on them, because one day they might just evaporate to a mega prime, right? Who's going to go help them in their CMMC journey, because they're just so rare. The Jacob Hills of the world are very rare individuals that can do all of that orchestration for a small business. And so make sure that you are paying close attention and buying them lots of meals and giving them lots of bonuses if you have these people on your staff.
Yeah, but I agree, because there's different competencies that you need as well.
Yeah. We call it the unicorn, right? It's hard to land a unicorn.
And you probably need 2 unicorns, because one is not enough. And in my case, doing it for my day job, Alamo City Engineering Services, initially it was just me doing the IT implementation, the migration over to GCC High. Years ago, when the API endpoints were not there and we had to work with AvePoint to get it all right, that was crazy. And then all the IT hardening that has to be done, so you got to have a smart IT person. You have to have somebody who understands compliance.
Yep.
So they have to understand, ideally, the NIST security controls. If they come from the ISO or SOC world, that's okay too. But CMMC has its own spin. So you got to, ideally send them over to CCP training to get up to speed. But there are all kinds of different paths to do this. And one of my concerns with the small businesses out there is, if they try this on their own and they're leaning on, junior to mid staff who don't have a lot of experience, you'll get all kinds of different solutions to a problem. Many of which could be maybe the wrong solution. It doesn't meet the compliance requirements, or maybe it's way more than you needed and way more than you needed to spend. You know what I mean? So let's talk about the next topic, which is design considerations.
This one's a fun one. So when we're looking at design considerations, there's a lot of things to consider as part of this, and a lot of due diligence has to be done. One of the really tricky things that people don't understand is that they really have kind of 2 solutions in front of them. They have what we call the all-in approach, which is, hey, just make everything compliant, top down, do it all. Or there's an approach called an enclave. Now, an enclave is typically a separate environment that's completely self-contained, maybe a little bit of an extension to on-prem, but that on-prem would be in a controlled environment, right? Maybe it's a single room with a printer and a plotter and a locked door, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people look at an enclave as the fast and easy thing to do. And it is. It's very easy to stand up a brand new environment, not impact your organization in any way outside of giving them a separate login and a virtual desktop to start using, right? Mm-hmm. What people don't understand is you have to first understand your data flow. Now, we talk to a lot of IT people. IT people, for some reason, are the ones that have been consistently tasked with figuring out CMMC. Mm-hmm. Well, IT people, sysadmins, net admins, cloud admins, they don't actually know the data flow of the organization. They know the core systems that have to be up in order for business to function, and they're maintaining and patching and updating those. But they don't know, number one, if they even have CUI. They don't know what systems might have that. Is it an ERP system? Does their email have CUI? Do physical media have CUI? What workstations have it? What servers? What networks? What sites? And so the very first step that you really need to do is go on what we would refer to as like a CUI hunt.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a bunch of keywords. Feel free to message me on LinkedIn and I can give you guys this list. But there's a bunch of keywords that we recommend running content searches inside of your cloud provider to start, right? Specifically your email provider. Things that can do OCR scans, right? So looking at attachments with PDFs and text of emails, because we want to see if any of these kind of immediately signal, oh my gosh, these people have CUI. Those people reside at these sites. This kind of is going to be the start of my interview process to figure out the scope of which I have CUI. Because once you understand the scope and how the data moves through the organization, then you can decide, do I do an enclave and I can separate all this data out? Or is it so pervasive that I need to make everything compliant? Right? Do I need to migrate whole cloud environments? So I need to bring things back on-prem. Do I need to change my ERP system? Right? Very kind of dramatic changes. So the very first step before we get into the all-in design or the enclave design is first off, understand where the CUI is in your organization, and then be able to kind of reconcile, okay, can I change the data flow to fit into a smaller area or what we call a smaller boundary? Or again, is it so pervasive, I just need to make everything compliant?
Hey folks, question for you. Do you know the status of your compliance controls right now? Like right now? We know that real-time visibility is critical for security, but when it comes to our GRC programs, we rely on point-in-time checks. But get this, more than 8,000 companies like Atlassian and Quora have continuous visibility into their controls with Vanta. Here's the gist. Vanta brings automation to evidence collection across 30 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. They also centralize key workflows like policies, access reviews, and reporting, and help you get security questionnaires done 5 times faster with AI. Now that's a new way to GRC. Learn more about Vanta at vanta.com/GRC Academy. Now back to the episode.
So here's the delineation that we have found. Once you have more than 15% of your user population having to have access to this controlled unclassified information on a daily basis, at that point is typically the tipping point that it's better to not have 2 parallel environments. Like an enclave and then a separate corporate environment, right? That is the tipping point where it's very likely going to make more financial sense to baseline everything to NIST 800-171, again, specifically all the assets that have that controlled and classified information, and to elevate everybody, because 2 major things are going to start happening after you eclipse 15% of your user population needing that data. Number 1, it's going to get sloppy. People are going to start cutting corners because they don't want to work in 2 environments, because now you have a large portion of your staff having to do it. And the second one is it's just not going to function the way it should, and you're going to have a lot of productivity hits. Because if you have people having to constantly context switch between 2 environments, you're going to lose productivity as part of that. And so again, we've seen that after you eclipse that 15% of your user population, that's where there needs to be some serious considerations on, can we keep our data flow maintained and people not get sloppy? And how much, if any, of a productivity hit are we experiencing? And is it worth justifying moving everybody to the Gov Cloud to enhance our productivity, not degrade it?
And that 15% number, the number of users that are in the CUI Enclave or would be, you've got to pay for licensing for your commercial cloud, and then you got to pay for the same people, in some cases or most cases, depending on how you work it, the GCC High cloud. And so is that the reason why you say that 15% number?
That's usually about the number, because you're starting to have diminishing returns. And so when you have an enclave, you have to dual license the people, one in the Gov Cloud, one in the commercial cloud. If you go the all-in approach, this is very important. I'm happy you brought it up. You need to try and time this with your renewal of your commercial licensing. So you don't have to continue paying the term on your commercial licensing and a new term for the Microsoft Gov licensing, because there has to be overlap in order to perform the migration. And so it's very important to time this, not only with general budget and have that, ready to go, but also look at all of your renewal dates of these contracts and try and time the migration so you're not having to pay a year of commercial licensing and a year of Gov Cloud licensing simultaneously, right? We want to drop one of those off and try and save some sort of money if you were to go with this all-in approach.
Well, I think one reason why I tend to like enclaves, and if I could, I would, but it's because that when I think about my corporate IT environment, okay, that corporate IT environment is for me and for my company. I don't want them having regulatory oversight and incident response and reporting responsibilities on my corporate environment. But at the same time, we have this problem, and this kills me. This problem of, all right, well, it's there for me to make money, yet our business is DoD.
Right.
Our business is federal government. And so it's kind of a difficult situation, because we're saying, okay, corporate environment, make me money. However, I can't process the stuff. Maybe you can't even respond to an RFP because it's March CUI on my corporate assets because they're not compliant. And so it's kind of a hard problem to tackle. I like the idea of CUI Enclaves, but I haven't come up with a great solution for it.
And sadly, there's really not. Enclaves are great because you can deploy them fast. Again, you can control the environment because it's a new environment. You typically aren't migrating a lot of content into it. You're building a greenfield environment to get certified for future contracts with that DFAR 7021 CMMC contractual obligation in it. But that's the tricky part. When you do an enclave, guess what? You have to have a separate email domain.
Yeah.
You have to have a separate a subdomain or a new top level vanity domain. Your users will have a separate login, separate multi-factor challenge. This will be a completely isolated and separate environment. And one of the trickiest parts about doing an enclave, and you brought this up, Jacob, is now you have to train external users. Hey, don't send CUI to my abc.com email address. Send it to my cui.abc.com email address.
Yeah.
Right. And you have to put in compensating controls now in your corporate environment to detect CUI and repel it so it never even gets delivered to this, unregulated environment, we'll call it, right? And so there's so many steps when you go through this where an enclave, yes, will save you a lot of time and it's a lot easier. You also open yourselves up for a lot more risk when it comes to this.
Yes.
And so it's really important to understand kind of what that looks like. And if you're looking at like a general risk matrix, this is a kind of a fun slide to look at. People don't realize that if they choose like a virtual desktop enclave, it's still fairly risky to do because you have two different data flows and you can't always control how people send you information, right? The all-in is more expensive, meaning the whole organization is in scope, at least again, all the CUI assets. But you get to bring your email domain with you. You get to bring all of your historical communication. You get to bring all legacy data with you as part of that. And so this is kind of that tension, as you were mentioning, Jacob. It's like, which one do I do? Do I need speed and ease of management to start? And then maybe I look at an all-in solution 1, 2, 3 years later? Or do I know I have such a big problem, I just need to go ahead and move everything to that all-in model, right? That lift and shift into that environment. Because what we just saw before earlier in the podcast is the timeline is shrinking for you to get compliant. A lot of organizations, because it's so late in the game, they're starting with an enclave. They're getting an environment that's what we would call certifiable, right? They're putting it under support. They're getting it compliant. They're getting it assessed. And they're making sure that any net new contracts anticipated with CMMC requirements will be able to fit and operate within that enclave. But in parallel, they're looking at their holistic infrastructure and looking to bring that up to compliance as well, and then get reassessed later down the line. And so when you're looking at this tension of which one do I do, the recommendation probably right now, from the sake of timing and assuming that you can control the data flow fairly well, is probably do an enclave for the sake of speed and ease while you do a holistic assessment to see what all else needs to be made compliant as part of your next level of, maybe a recertification of your whole organization, 12 months, 24 months, maybe even 36 months down the line.
Well, let's dive into the design of a CUI enclave. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so an enclave can take kind of a few different forms. The most traditional form of an enclave is a virtual desktop environment. So your corporate device is completely left out of scope, which is fantastic news. You don't have to do anything to that. And then the virtual desktop, if configured correctly, is where all of your CUI is going to be. So we do our deployments in the Microsoft GCC High Cloud and the Azure Gov environment. So that way we can have both basic CUI and specified CUI like ITAR, EAR, things of that nature. So the user would log in with their separate identity, get a multi-factor challenge, and now they'd be presented with a brand new Windows 11 desktop with whatever applications they need installed. They can go do their work, check their Gov email address, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, all of those types of services. And then when they're done, they can just close the session out and get back to their regular workstation. Or some people just keep it up on a second screen. And that's kind of the tightest enclave boundary you could have. So that's called a cloud-only enclave. But then we realize, you know what? Some people need to connect back to on-prem, right? For the sake of the CUI they're working with.
That's right.
And so maybe you need a print, maybe you need a plot, maybe you need a physical workstation because you get your CUI drawings on USB drives, right? And so this is what we refer to as a hybrid enclave. So it's majority in the cloud with some physical representation. So that could be maybe an office inside of a facility that's secured for printing CUI. Maybe that's a few workstations for staging of, again, USB information. Maybe that's some mobile devices or iPads to take into the field or into a job site, right? And so just know that an enclave might look a little bit different for you based on your needs. But the ultimate takeaway here is it's just a part of my technology, not all of my technology and all of my sites having to become compliant, just very targeted and segmented parts of that.
Yeah. And when you talk about the VDI being configured properly, tell us what that means.
That's a great question, because that can be a little nuanced if you're not familiar with it. So you need to make sure that copying, pasting is disabled, that they can't take screenshots of it, that they can't redirect local devices into that environment, right? Like if I plug a USB into my physical computer, it can't be read in the virtual desktop. So those are just some of the things that need to be done so that you can make sure that your physical device stays out of scope for any CUI and stays outside of your CMMC boundary.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a beautiful thing. If you have just a generic business that doesn't have any need to bring CUI on site, everything's virtual, everything's in the cloud, your systems on your desk aren't in scope, that is a beautiful thing. But construction, probably manufacturers, they're a different story, right?
Absolutely. You have to produce some kind of controlled and classified information typically, right? So we work with a lot of construction and manufacturing clients, and having it all in the cloud is just a non-option, right? They have to produce or have some physical representation of that data most of the time. And so that's where we do a lot of these hybrid enclave approaches, where we're connecting it to a separate network inside of an existing facility, and they're securing some individual rooms for the processing, storing, and transmitting of the CUI, right? And so that's kind of a really good and smart thing to understand, is you don't have to bring everything in scope if CUI touches your physical facility, right? Just try and control where that goes in your physical facility and make those spaces compliant.
Yeah.
Same thing with manufacturing, right? So there's a specific CMMC asset type called specialized assets that don't have all the same rules as traditional, what I would call corporate CUI assets, so that you can have a separate security policy to manage your operational manufacturing environment and connect your enclave and pull that data down into that OT space, right? That's governed by kind of a separate set of security policies. So yeah, there's different flavors of these kind of hybrid enclaves depending on your need, but just know that it definitely has the ability to extend your capability to process, store, and transmit CUI.
Yeah, yeah. And something folks need to understand is that it's not just buying technology. That's a big part of the picture, okay? A big part of the controls are technical, but there are services happening. There are people doing things. There are people monitoring their environment and responding to any incidents. And on the other side of it, there's processes that you have to bake into your business processes. And you have to get your people trained up on how to properly handle this CUI. It just can't be uploaded anywhere. It just can't be put anywhere. All of those things. I was speaking with Richard Wakeman. He's the chief architect over at Microsoft for Aerospace and Defense. And he is like the GCC high. He's the man over there.
Oh, right? He's the wizard, dude. He's fantastic. I love some Richard Wakeman.
Yes, yes. Really, really smart person. So one of the interesting things he was talking about is if you have an enclave, there's some trickery you can do with the email MX records so that the emails going to your commercial actually are processed on the GCC high side. And then you can probably set up DLP, to check for CUI. And if there's no CUI, then forward it over to your commercial. I don't even know if that's documented anywhere. I don't know how to do that, but it sounded like an interesting concept. So, I mean, there might be some ways to mitigate that problem of data flow, because that is a big problem. Training your customers, they're going to mess it up. You know what I mean?
Oh, 100%.
They're going to email the wrong domain for sure.
Absolutely. It will happen. It's not an if, it's just a when problem with enclaves. And, Richard Wakeman, he came on our live stream kind of Q&A that we do every Friday, and he mentioned that same thing. And in my mind, I'm like, well, you have reply to addresses. And how does that work if it's in a different commercial tenant? And, I'm excited to sit down with him and hopefully try and crack this code where an organization can appear as a single entity, right? And that's the hard part, right? An enclave looks like a separate entity than your regular corporate email address. And that's what a lot of people don't like. I was in conversations with a 14,000 person company that we ended up helping, And they end up splitting their staff 7,000 and 7,000 because of this issue. They wanted one public-facing email domain, but because they couldn't do it, they had to segment into two different publicly facing email domains. One was a subdomain and one was the primary. So it's definitely been a problem plagued in the enclave/corporate network environment for sure.
Yeah, right. Well, I can't wait to see what you guys come up with.
That makes two of us, my friend.
I'll be watching.
We just talked about enclaves, and enclaves are a great model if you can, again, make your data flow work for it, right? However, some organizations might not have the luxury of being able to carve out their CUI to such an isolated environment, right? Maybe they have more than 15% of their staff that need access to it on a daily basis. Maybe they have critical business applications that they can't reproduce in a separate environment like an enclave. And so this is what we refer to as the all-in model. So this is looking across your whole corporate IT infrastructure and looking at all of your CUI assets, which are anything that process, store, and transmit CUI, and making those compliant. So maybe that's moving from Microsoft Commercial to the Microsoft Gov Cloud, right? Maybe that's now moving to a compliant ERP system. Maybe that's hardening all of your workstations and mobile devices. Maybe that's hardening your local networks and buying FIPS validated, firewalls and things of that nature. This is what we refer to that all-in approach. So an enclave can be spun up within, 2-3 months, pretty fast to spin up and get documented. An all-in solution, which would be migrating all of your users to potentially a brand new environment or multiple new environments, right? If you have to change multiple applications, this could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, depending on the size of your organization, and some even longer than that, right? We work with several enterprises that this has been a multi-year journey for them to be able to achieve CMMC. So although it's very expensive as a small business, you have one really strong benefit, and that is your agility. You can turn on a dime way faster than the large businesses that have the money, but don't have the agility that you have. So make sure to use that to your advantage.
Hey folks, you may not know this, but I'm also leading a CMMC compliance program at a defense contractor. There's a lot involved with CMMC, and I understand how it can feel overwhelming. I was there myself many years ago, but since then, I've created CMMC training focused on defense contractors. The training covers everything from DFARS contractual clauses to NIST 800-171A, and of course, CMMC. It's received over 100 5-star reviews and is certainly worth checking out. Find it at grcacademy.io. Now back to the episode.
Let's shift into crazy war stories. All
right? Man, what a time. Okay. I get a phone call from somebody and they're like, Daniel, we have an issue. I'm like, oh no. I was like, what happened? They were hacked, right? And they had a hack by a non-friendly country. And they had exfiltration of sensitive, controlled, unclassified information. So the DoD was brought in, the FBI was brought in, and when you pop the hood on it, you find out that there should have been way more of NIST 800-171 implemented that could have potentially prevented that data exfiltration from happening.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so that's just one kind of story, right? Not a great story, not one you want to share, not one you want to have to call and tell the DoD just happened to you, right?
Yeah.
We have other crazy war stories. There's one company I talked to, you'll get a kick out of this. They were a small manufacturer, mom and pop shop, like 20, 30 people, right? And they call and they say, Daniel, we think we're good with CMMC. I said, that's fantastic. Tell me what you've done, right? Let me just kind of get a general gauge on where you are.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, well, we've taken our server and we moved it up to the attic and now we put it behind a locked door. And so we're good. We secured the server. And that was like them thinking realistically that they actually did that, right? Wow. And so and I appreciate the effort, and they genuinely thought that they were doing the right thing. However, they didn't have all the right information on what it actually takes to secure that.
Yeah.
And then we have stories kind of in between all that. We have, a massive breach all the way through people thinking that a physical lock on a door is enough to stop somebody from stealing their CUI. We have people that have gone through PE, private equity acquisitions,
Mhm.
And the private equity firm call us after the transaction, who we've never spoken to. And they say, hey, this company we just bought, they said they were CMMC ready and that they were certified, but then, they didn't have some of the documentation for it, but we took their word for it and it added to their valuation.
Mm.
Only to find out they were not CMMC ready. They did not have the NIST 800-171 implemented. They did not have it down to the assessment objective level actually written out, right? So that's just kind of, if you're going through a due diligence process, which I think acquisitions are going to take off pretty significantly over the next couple of years, make sure that due diligence around that's really well buttoned up, because you might buy a company that attests to CMMC compliance, but actually has not done the work to get there. Another one that's a more recent development is there's this terminology called FedRAMP moderate equivalency.
Yeah.
Right. So for those that don't know what that is, FedRAMP moderate is as a cloud authorization that you have to process, store, transmit CUI. Well, there was language written in the DFAR 7012 contract that allowed you to have equivalent FedRAMP moderate clouds, meaning a non-authorized cloud, but you're meeting the same requirements.
Yes.
Well, the DoD last January published a memo actually clarifying what the requirements were, right?
Blew it up.
They blew it up. They basically said you have to do even more than a FedRAMP authorized cloud provider. You have to have no POAMs, basically, right?
Yeah.
So no open action items at the time of your 3PAO assessment. Well, I got a phone call the other day about somebody that signed a contract with one of these providers that was FedRAMP moderate equivalency. And guess what? Turns out they were not, and could not produce all of the documentation as it related to their actual assessment. And this company was going through an actual joint surveillance assessment. It was the end of last year. And they failed their assessment because this company could not prove that they were still equivalent. Because that's the tricky part. If you're authorized, you're in the marketplace for a good long while, right? And then you get renewed through that process, so forth and so on. If you're FedRAMP moderate equivalent, you have to keep proving that you're FedRAMP moderate equivalent, potentially.
Every single assessment.
Every single assessment. And so that's high risk. And one of the organizations we talked to failed their assessment because their cloud provider claiming equivalency failed. They were no longer equivalency, and they were no longer equivalent for about a 6-week period. And then they came back and they fixed the issues and they were now equivalent again. But by that time, the assessment had passed. The assessment was over and their client had failed their assessment because of it. So there's so many war stories of people getting hacked when they shouldn't have been because they should have implemented NIST. People buying companies attesting to CMMC compliance and were nowhere near it. Companies using tools that they thought were trusted tools, they didn't get certified because of the lack of compliance of those tools. So when we're talking war stories, Jacob, I got a Rolodex full of them. So,
oh man, yeah, wow. One thing that I'll end with here, though, is this big problem we have now with the ESP designation. Okay,
yep,
that includes IT managed service providers, but it also includes your cloud service providers, your Microsofts, your other cloud providers that will process CUI and store CUI. But you also have cloud security protection assets. A big gap that I'm seeing that drives me crazy is none of these security protection assets that are in the clouds have CRMs for NIST 800-171. You'll find some that are FedRAMP authorized, and they will provide the NIST 853 version, which you can map. But a lot of these cloud providers don't have that. And what I was complaining about this the other day, and I was saying that, okay, we have all these companies going after different certifications, different attestations, SOC 2 and ISO 27001, and they spend money on fancy GRC tools. Like, these GRC tools need to be able to spit out those CRMs that map to all these frameworks. That will help us a lot. And that's a big problem. I think that we're going to continue to experience big pain that a lot of the defense contractors are going to be dealing with this year specifically, because we have to send the signal to these companies. We need this document. And in some cases, it's going to result in less security because maybe we can't use a password manager now, something ridiculous like that. Thankfully, we have, Keeper, Security, Password Manager out there. They're FedRamped, they can provide that CRM. But if it's some other solution that maybe, application allow listing and all those things, and then just-in-time access and all those, like a lot of those folks don't have CRMs.
All sorts of them. And I'm not saying that those companies specifically don't have it or do have it. I'm actually not sure. But you're right. They don't have the client responsibility matrix. Like, what am I supposed to do? What's left for me to do for CMMC, right? You're providing all these fantastic services to me, but there's still going to be a gap, because guess what? There's no way you can meet all 110 and 320 assessment objectives. I need you guys to tell me what I have to do so that I can then make sure that I'm trued up in those areas. Because that's a very common misstep, Jacob. A lot of organizations think if they go to a Gov cloud, AWS, if they go to Microsoft, Azure Gov, if they go to GCC High, they think that they inherit full CMMC on top of that, that the environment's already configured and protected. And we see a lot of FedRAMP in this same bucket where they're using an Azure Gov or AWS Gov data center, and they think their application is now automatically FedRAMPed. Also not true.
That's right.
Doesn't work for CMMC, doesn't work for FedRAMP. And so people have to be very aware of that. And you're right, Jacob, we need more transparency with that. And we need more direct access to be able to receive those documents quicker than having to go through weeks and months of solicitation asking, please give it to us, because we have to have it for our actual assessments. It's a little tricky with SPAs too, security protection assets, especially on the cloud, because some of these SPAs might actually be processing, storing, or transmitting CUI.
Yes.
They might be doing sandboxing. They might be scanning your files through spam filters, right? And so the other part of exposure there, just to tack onto that, is like, not only you need to know the security controls, but now you need to make sure that they're FedRAMP clouds. And if you don't know they're actually doing those activities because of the customer responsibility matrix, then how do you even know to check if they should be FedRAMP or not? So it's a slippery slope that I agree a lot of the vendors out there that do security protection work need to make sure to get in line and be able to produce that information very quickly so that we can understand the level of risk that we're taking on using them as a product.
There are so many gotchas.
So many.
And folks, I would encourage you, reach out to Summit 7. If not them, find another trusted advisor, reach out to a CCP, a CCA, find a consultant company that have CCAs on staff. CMMC certified assessors, they are the most educated, on all of this, in my opinion. We're seeing a lot of different companies pop up, especially this year. And they're seeing CMMC as a business line.
As a money grab, quite honestly.
And they are they're seeing an opportunity, but they're new to the space and they don't understand it. And I just had a gentleman named Miguel Villarreal on the podcast. He said that he could have saved $300,000 if he would have just known some of the foundational pieces and gotten some good advice in the beginning. So do your due diligence, folks. Summit 7, I love those folks. Reach out to them. Where can people find you, Daniel?
People can find me on LinkedIn. So Daniel Akridge, Akridge, or they can email me at daniel.akridge@summit7.us. I'd be happy to help anybody I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacob.
Hey, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. If you want to see more, be sure to subscribe and then check out this video.